Hello, welcome to Descent into Madness, and pretty simple, this is my top 10 video game controllers. Number 10, the N64 controller. Now you may be thinking this is a bit of an odd choice because I also said in my other top 10 video that this is a Nintendo screw-up. It is, but in my opinion, it's a good controller. I like holding it, I like looking at it, I like playing it, or playing on it. Simply put, moving on. The NES Controller. Some people may say that I'm only putting this on this list, or some people who, let me rephrase that. Some people who would make a top 10 gaming controllers list would say, this deserves the number 9 spot because the N64 saved the US, or not N64, the NES saved the US gaming market, and this is a controller with that console, so therefore it deserves a spot. No. It's comfortable. It's iconic. Top gaming controller from like 85 to 91. And yeah, pretty fun. Moving on. The Sega Dreamcast controller. Now, the reason this is so low on this list is because I have very little experience with this controller. I've only held it a few times in my life, but it is a very comfortable controller. Sega, who is thought of as a retro company mostly, because they kind of are, made a nice controller which is very similar to modern day gamepads now, minus the fact that it only has one analog stick. But it had an analog stick, as I just mentioned, shoulder buttons, which I'm not sure the Saturn had, and it had buttons that are laid out very similar to like DualShock, Xbox 360, stuff like that. It had an a D-pad along with an analog stick, and on top of that, it's a very comfortable controller. Another reason it's so low on this list is because of the awkward placing of the wire you plug it into. Why it's on the bottom instead of on the top, I'll never know. Moving on. The Wiimote. Wii Remote, Wii Controller, Wii Troller, whatever you want to call it. Ignore the microwave. It's an odd controller, to say the least. It's just kind of a stick. That's my mother talking. It has motion controls, which is fairly new at the time it came out. It just had a D-pad, no analog stick unless you plugged in the nunchuck. And yeah, pretty much this is just put on this list for nostalgia, because I had this, because the Wii was one of my first consoles. And it had some pretty good games too. Brawl, Twilight Princess, Metroid Other M, Corruption, just to name a few. Moving on. The Sega Genesis controller. Now I really wrestled with putting this on this list at all. Before I made this video, I held it for a few minutes, kind of mashed the buttons, and it's a bit of an awkward controller. But a lot of people seem to like it. I do like it, it's just not... I just don't think it's a super good controller. But I was thinking of putting the Sega Genesis 6-button controller in this spot, thinking that it number one, it had more buttons, and it was easier to play games on, and number two, because it was more comfortable. But after I watched a quick review of the 6-button controller, I discovered the guy who reviewed it thought it was good, like the Sega Genesis controller, but awkward to hold. So I was like, if I'm going to put this on this list, might as well just go with the original. The design kind of started the trend of kind of making a controller rounded and having grips at the bottom. Like, soon after, the Saturn, PlayStation, and even Nintendo would follow in its footsteps, and later on the Microsoft with Xbox. It has a nice function where you can kind of hop between buttons, so that's kind of nice. It has a nice D-pad. Yeah, moving on. The DualShock 4. Now this one is really just going off word of mouth. I've held it a few times. I think it's okay. Though I've heard it's really good. Even the PC game on. I like the other DualShocks. Spoilers for later on in the list. Nice controller. Moving on. The SNES controller. Once again, this is just going off word of mouth. I have never held this controller in my life, unlike the other controllers on this list. Though, compared to the awkward, or in my opinion, awkward feel of the Sega Genesis controller, I'm sure it's good. It's got a good design, good button layout, one of the first consoles to have shoulder buttons, all that good stuff. If you have a Super Nintendo, use a Super Nintendo controller. It's kind of obvious, but obvious statement is obvious, so moving on. The controller that this brand used for years. It's the DualShock 1 through 3 and the 6-axis controller by PlayStation. I love these controllers so much. They're so comfortable. They like revolutionized controllers today. And why do you think Sony used them for so long and didn't retire this controller until the PlayStation 4 came out? Because they're just that good. Oh yeah, and to my knowledge, they're the first controllers to have 2 shoulder buttons on either side. So yeah, that's cool. What hasn't been said about this controller? The Xbox 360 controller. Oh man. The Xbox One needs to take notes from this controller. If the PlayStation DualShock revolutionized what controllers are today, then the Xbox 360 perfected it. That was my phone going off. I apologize for that. But perfect, and I mean perfect, position of analog sticks. Crappy D-pad, sure. Good shoulder buttons. All 4 of them. Face buttons could use a little work. But overall, good design, good ergonomics. Very comfortable controller. Some may have seen this coming. Others will be completely shocked by this one. The Gamecube Controller. That's right. Yeah. Okay. Simple as to why this is number 1. Have you ever heard of any other company reviving a controller that is 2 generations old to their current generation console? Besides Nintendo and the GameCube controller. Exactly. Because this controller is that good. There's all the reasons of why this is number 1. Nostalgia, comfort, literally still play to this day, even though it's 2 generations old. Wow. The analog stick is great, the C stick is decent, shoulder buttons are good, face buttons are good, ergonomics are great. Oh my god, I love this controller so much. Well, hope you enjoyed my top 10 controllers. See you next time.